In July 1921, General Billy Mitchell, a great advocate of air power, proved the value of the bomber by sinking the captured German battleship, the Ostfriesland, off the east coast of the United States. But this feat did not change the opinion of the armed services. As far as they were concerned, the Air Corps was there to support ground forces alone. It was to be another 13 years before a multi-engine bomber was requested. Used to building single-engined aircraft, most of the aircraft industry understood this to mean 2 engines. Only Boeing considered using 4. Model 299, as it was then called, first flew on July the 28th, 1935 at Seattle. It was then flown the 2,100 miles to Wright Field non-stop for evaluation and competitive trials. This flight alone proved that Boeing had developed something special. With an average speed of 232 miles an hour, it was faster than the maximum speed of all of its rivals.
To England, Australia, India, Africa, Alaska they go, making it possible to hit...
The only part of the aircraft's performance that was the same as other aircraft was the bomb load. Boeing had chosen to install 4 engines, not to carry greater loads, but to fly further, faster, and higher.
The bomb bay doors open. Bombs away.
And the aircraft also carried a vast array of defensive armament, with up to 12 heavy machine guns. Amazed by the world's first all-metal, 4-engined monoplane bomber, a newspaper reporter dubbed it a 15-ton flying fortress, and the name stuck. Although the B-17 went into production, only 13 were ordered for trial purposes. However, as the war in Europe progressed, the USA learned much about aerial combat. They watched the massacre of unescorted RAF daylight bombers. Then they saw how RAF fighters defended British skies against the massed formations of Luftwaffe bombers during the Battle of Britain, and they tuned their strategy accordingly. Boeing had spent many years perfecting the B-17 to be a high-altitude bomber. At a height of 5 miles, the air was thin, and therefore new oxygen systems were fitted. The engines needed superchargers, and everything in the aircraft was tested to make sure it worked in the intense cold. By flying bombing missions at the unheard-of height of 25,000 feet, 15,000 feet higher than either the RAF or the Luftwaffe, they believed that they could avoid anti-aircraft gunfire. In the event of an attack from enemy fighters, they believed that the array of defenses would get them through. The USAAF now believed they had a bomber ready to cope with the stresses of aerial combat.
The invincibility of the bomber had its inceptions back in the days, of course, when Billy Mitchell first bombed the whatever the German ship was out at sea. And the opposition to the bomber in those days was pretty lightly armed too. P-12s and P-26s really were no match for a B-17, none at all. And from this mismatch in our earlier days, I think grew the legend that the B-17 was, and particularly in a sizable formation, would just be practically an invincible force. And the P-40, when it came along, really still didn't terribly challenge this concept. And it wasn't until we really ran up against the next generation, which was the 109 and the Focke-Wulf 190, that we realized that this had introduced a whole new dimension in aerial warfare.
On December the 7th, 1941, the Japanese attacked the US Navy base at Pearl Harbor. Finally, the USA joined the struggle against Germany and Japan. But it'll always be the European theatre of war that the B-17 will be best remembered for. On July the 1st, 1942, though, when the first aircraft arrived in Britain, there was still no hint of the huge role they would play. The Fortresses were undoubtedly the finest aircraft America had ever flown, but the crews were still inexperienced. They'd never flown in anger, and many gunners had yet to fire their guns. Despite this, they were given a very clear directive by the commander of the European Theatre of Operations, Lieutenant General Dwight D. Eisenhower: achieve air superiority over Western France by April the 1st, 1943. Unfortunately, this order was virtually impossible to fulfill. Even as the US build-up began in Britain, aircraft were being diverted to take part in Operation Torch, the US invasion of North Africa. Still, the first raid undertaken by the new 8th Bomber Command was a success. On August the 17th, 1942, 12 B-17s attacked the railway yards at Rouen in northern France. The B-17s dropped 37,000 pounds of bombs and returned without loss. It was a good mission to ease the command into the war. There were no daring Luftwaffe fighter pilots, desperate for glory. The bombs were dropped with reasonable accuracy, and the target was near enough for Spitfires to escort them all the way there and back. It wouldn't always be so easy. The first major shock for the 8th came on October the 9th, 1942. 107 bombers attacked steel and locomotive works at Lille. Of the 69 that reached the primary target, 4 were shot down, and only 9 bombs fell within 500 yards of the aiming point. The US Army Air Force, under the command of General Carl Spaatz, was beginning to see that the job was more difficult than many people had thought. Ahead of them was a difficult winter. Bad weather, cancelled missions, and severe losses would severely test the soul of the command.
The cold was the worst thing. The fact that you could touch a piece of metal and your finger would stick to it. 40 degrees below zero, 60 degrees below zero. Sometimes I flew back in the waist. On a few missions I flew in the waist. It was unbelievable back there. With open waist windows a lot of the time. And that air just blowing through there. When I first got over there, you saw so many guys that had frostbite, and it was terrible. But the cold was the worst thing for me.
It soon became obvious that the command had got their tactics wrong, so major changes were instigated in the way missions were flown. Gone were the 3 aircraft bombing formations. Instead, up to 54 aircraft covering a height of 850 feet would bomb simultaneously. To improve accuracy, the best crews were put at the front of each formation. They became known as the lead crews.
Colonel LeMay, when he was command of the 305th Bomb Group, and was confronted with the problems that they were in the early days, back in 1942, of placing bombs on the target, or at least within a reasonable distance found that it was necessary to have all bombs dropped on signal from the lead aircraft. And he knew that he could take 10 of these better crews, and in practice missions, you wouldn't be able to distinguish between them. But under the conditions of combat, there would be some of those crews that would do better than the others. And this is what they tried to determine when they appointed a lead crew.
The one factor that still caused problems was the lack of escort fighters. Deep into Germany, the B-17s were at the mercy of the German fighters, and despite the firepower of 12 guns in each of 54 aircraft in a formation, losses were unacceptable. The weak link was in the nose, so a chin turret was added. The new B-17G became the most numerous production variant. On August the 17th, the anniversary of the 8th Bomber Command's first mission, two major factories were targeted: the ball bearing factory at Schweinfurt and the Messerschmitt complex at Regensburg. The 4th Bombardment Wing, commanded by General Curtis LeMay, provided 146 B-17s against Regensburg, and General Robert Williams's 1st Bombardment Wing sent 230 of them to Schweinfurt.
There's 4 of them, 1 o'clock high.
They're coming around. Watch.
Two fighters, 6 o'clock up, coming in, diving.
Diving through the 94th.
3 planes, 9 o'clock, coming around. Keep your eye on them, boys.
Around the 10.
Watch them, Chuck. Keep your eyes open.
They're breaking at 11. Breaking at 11.
I got them. Coming around underneath at 10 o'clock.
I see them. 2 at 2 o'clock.
Watch them, Scotty. I got sights on them.
Check that B-17, Chuck. 3 o'clock. Motor's smoking. Fighters, 10:30, coming around.
Those 10:30 upper or lower?
More than 700 tons of bombs were dropped. The Messerschmitt complex was badly hit, but less damage was inflicted on the ball bearing factory. However, losses were heavy. 60 aircraft were shot down and 600 crewmen lost. 30 aircraft were abandoned in North Africa, where the Regensburg force landed and refueled. 28 that got home were badly damaged. 118 aircraft lost and only 25 German fighters shot down. Morale slumped. The 8th fell back to lick its wounds.
That was the most horrendous day that I spent in the entire war, was the first Schweinfurt show. We started being attacked about mid-channel on our way into Germany, and it was a continuous running fight all the way essentially to the target. And you could look out the window at any spare minute you had almost and see a B-17 spinning out of control, exploding in the air. I never saw anything like it.
But on October the 14th, the B-17s went back to Schweinfurt. In the preceding 10 days, 88 aircraft had been lost, but 300 were still sent to the target. Another 60 were shot down, and that day became known as Black Thursday.
We flew back. We could have flown back just following the fires on the ground from crashed airplanes, both enemy and American. Our 60 B-17s and I don't know how many German fighters, but
we made it back to Biggins Hills, and I believe it was a British transport plane took us back to our base the next day, where we really discovered the scope of the disaster. All the officers, flying officers in my group, left, could eat at one table. I was made a first pilot at that point. 4 of us were actually made first pilots. The next mission, I think I was more afraid of taking off and landing than I was the mission, because I had been on more missions than I had taken off and landed. The 4th mission after that, I was the only one left of the 4 co-pilots that had been made first pilots.
A mission was a long, dangerous time for a B-17. The crew of 10 had to cope with intense cold, flying for hours at 25,000 feet where the air temperature was 40 degrees below. And then there were always the fighters. A damaged aircraft would inevitably straggle behind the rest of the formation. And a single aircraft was a sitting duck for enemy fighters. There was nothing the rest of the formation could do. It always closed up. Safety in numbers until the next attack. The most dangerous time was in the bombing run. No evasive action was allowed. They had to keep straight and level. They waited for the lead crew to signal bombs away, and then they bombed together. Now they turned for home, but there were always more fighters and more flak. Those that fought their way through could see the ground crew anxiously waiting to see how many had returned, and there were always some missing. The aircraft with wounded on board landed first. But the mission was not over. A quick stop for coffee was followed by the debriefing. Did you hit the target? Did you see any of our ships shot down? Were there any parachutes? The grilling went on until the last piece of information was eked out. Only then could the weary crews get some sleep. At that time, a crew's tour of duty was 25 missions. A 4% loss rate meant that there was a slim chance that one crew would survive and return to the United States. But a 4% loss rate did not happen very often. The first and most famous example of a crew to finish their tour was that of the Memphis Belle. By the winter of 1943, it was obvious that the tactics were not working. German production was not being badly affected, and worst of all, the German fighters had control of the air. But in January of 1944, two new arrivals improved the situation. First, the new P-51 Mustang began to equip the fighter squadrons. With 108-gallon drop tanks, they could escort the bombers all the way deep into Germany and back. Second, the invention of a new blind bombing radar system meant that missions could be flown in bad weather. From February the 20th, Big Week, as it became known, targeted the Luftwaffe. Every conceivable aircraft factory, assembly plant, storage park, and airfield was attacked. Again, losses were high, 226 aircraft lost. But the Luftwaffe was hit hard. 2 months of production was lost. Germany now chose to disperse production, and that made it harder to attack, but at the same time, it put extra pressure on the already overloaded German transport system. Never again would German fighters hammer a formation of B-17s from the beginning of a mission to the end. June 6, 1944, D-Day. Thousands of tons of high explosives were dropped in support of the invasion. Tanks, gun emplacements, troop concentrations, bridges and rail centres, all were flattened, and barely a German fighter was seen all day. In 3 months, the 8th flew for 78 days out of 92. Oil and industry were still the main strategic targets, but tactical targets were chosen on their merit. By September, despite German aircraft production working at full strength again, fuel supplies had been cut by 75%. German aircraft couldn't fly, and they were destroyed on the ground at a rate of 500 a week. By January 1945, there were very few strategic targets left ahead of the British and American advances into Germany. So it was decided to help the Russians by hitting targets chosen by the Kremlin. The great communication centers of Eastern Germany were selected: Berlin, Dresden, Chemnitz, Leipzig. Target after target was destroyed, as the B-17s flew virtually untouched by the Luftwaffe. By the end of February, Germany was crumbling. On April the 16th, General Karl Spaatz sent out a message to his commanders: "The advances of our ground forces have brought to a close the strategic air war." For 10 years, the great Boeing production lines had turned out an ever-increasing number of B-17s, 12,731 in all. Flown by courageous pilots, navigators, gunners and bombardiers, and worked on by tireless ground crew, the B-17s pounded occupied Europe and Nazi Germany by day, while the RAF hammered them by night. The B-17 was a classic design that proved itself as capable in combat as in testing. It richly deserved to be called Fortress of the Skies.